aggregation for like a specific group, let's say, I don't know, like lesbian women in like a specific, and to see if like there's like a similar curve or...
Yeah, I've always had this qualitative approach. I did one article with the relief maps with 7 people, so it's difficult to aggregate data when you have such small samples. But now we have with this new project, I'll try to have this a bigger sample. I said we would have a sample of 1,000 people. We'll see if it's possible or not. But our aim is to systematize all this from also quantitative perspective, so we can have this quantitative data and can do some analysis from an intersectional perspective, which is not easy because intersectionality and feminism, there's an important critique to positivism in general and quantitative methods, and it's difficult to find ways of analyzing this kind of data from a quantitative perspective. But we'll try to do it.
And just a small second question, because I'm working personally on rural areas. I'm wondering if like you could apply the same methods, like the relief maps, without digital methods. And also, like I like this idea of collective debate, but I'm wondering in like a context where like there is a high oppression, would it be fine for people to debate about their personal or individual relief maps when they are like with people who might like be oppressed, like where they feel like it's too sensitive to discuss, that I'm not feeling comfortable in this space?
Yeah, I never ask specific questions to specific people. So when I have these debates, I ask just general questions, and I always can see people that it's like silent and looking downwards and is not participating in the space. And there are ways of like protecting these spaces. Like I never do like small groups. So it's always the big group, and whoever wants to talk, they talk. And if there's people that want to stay silent, they stay silent. So they don't feel the pressure to speak. I think it's a really important issue. So not to enhance participation, let's say, so that only those who want to participate participate. And we've also tried these relief maps in rural areas. You can use them through this digital website, but also by hand. I still use this by hand way, and it's also really interesting. So when you are drawing and you are like writing, it's also interesting as a transformative process. I think that the paper and the colors have other possibilities, other potentialities.
No. You know what? I think maybe we should move on and keep your questions for afterwards in the Q&A, okay? Just so that we give enough time for everything. But yeah, I'm sorry for the interruption. I think the Zoom just stopped. Valerie? Yeah. Yes, I will just share your presentation. I hope the live stream is working okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
I think we minimize the Okay.
Morning, or I guess good afternoon now, everyone. Muchas gracias to Panagiota for convening this workshop. It's so wonderful to be in a small group. You know, it's so much more enriching than large conferences. I'm so grateful to be here. On my way from the airport to this institute, my driver was Bangladeshi, and I told him that I don't speak very good Spanish, and he said I don't speak very good English. So we found a third language to speak in, which is Hindi. So I already feel very at home in this wonderful global city of yours. I'm so happy to be and honored to be on the panel with Maria and Alice. And I'm very, very happy to be with my good friend, Isabel Angelewski, in the flesh, because we've been communicating via email on some papers and some writing that we've been doing on gentrification in DC. And I'm so grateful to your intellectual leadership. You know, I've never told you this, Isabel, but I had a PhD student a little while ago present her work. And I said, so which scholarly audiences do you want to contribute to, or which scholar do you model yourself after? And she said, I want to be like Isabel Angelewski. This is what she said to me. And I was waiting for a good moment to tell this story, and this is.
Tell that to my family. This is the most unstable person I've had.
When Margareta sent us the prompt for today, which is to talk through some of the reasons why this work is so urgent, why a feminist intersectional approach is so urgent. I wanted to share with you my work on Washington, DC, which I named Climate Justice Through a Feminist Ethics of Care and Radical Histories of Abolition. And there's a bit of a personal backstory here as to why I started studying climate justice in the capital city of the United States of America, which is that when I reached the School of International Service, which is a large school of international relations in the heart of American empire, I was somewhat perplexed at the fact that students really wanted to study underdevelopment and inequality, and poverty in far-flung places like Nairobi and New Delhi, but they absolutely had very little understanding and were actually miseducated or undereducated on questions of de facto apartheid, on questions of settler colonialism and underdevelopment in their own backyards, namely Washington, DC. So with that sort of pedagogic goal in mind, I put together a team and a research proposal tackling urban vulnerability, lessons for climate justice in Washington, DC. And it was funded by the Metropolitan Policy Center. Our good friend and colleague, Derek Hyra, took great interest in this project, and I have to thank him and the center for supporting this project. The background here also is that ever since Hurricane Sandy struck the eastern seaboard in 2012, cities on the East Coast of the United States have understood that they are not immune to the effects of climate change. Maps such as these produced by Climate Central envision this sort of catastrophic end of century sea level rise and how the capital city of the United States will lose billions of dollars worth of real estate and monuments and national heritage sites and real estate right? And so the idea here in projecting these kind of hyperbolic images is to sort of jolt people into action. And in 2016, the District of Columbia produced a vulnerability and risk assessment report in which it laid out vulnerability indicators for the District of Columbia. And it mapped those, and the District of Columbia is a diamond. It's shaped like this, where there's 8 wards total. And this vulnerability report mapped the most climate vulnerable wards of DC along 5 indicators: percent without a high school diploma, percent unemployment, percent in poverty, percent obese, and percent with adult asthma, or as we say in India, asthma. I don't know how you pronounce it here, but the condition of the upper respiratory tract. And it used these 5 indicators to designate DC's wards 7 and 8, so in deep red here, 7 and 8, across the Anacostia River. So the diamond is kind of cut through by 2 major rivers, the Potomac and the Anacostia River, and east of the Anacostia River are wards 7 and 8, which were deemed to be the most vulnerable to climate change. They also happen to be the areas that are more than 90% African American, and where household income is, net wealth is 1/20th of the net wealth of households in the wealthiest parts of the city. Life expectancy is 27 years less than the wealthiest wards of DC. But the challenges here of this kind of vulnerability mapping, right, is it takes vulnerability as a kind of given context, right, without really looking at the causes of vulnerability, right? And the language of climate resilience, as I've critiqued in my work, tends to put the spotlight on future risk, right, flooding or heat waves or hurricanes, right, without really considering how we got here in the first place. Now, in contrast to such climate resilience and vulnerability framings, which are quite mainstream, which put the spotlight on future threats and therefore call into action these kind of technocratic fixes. It seemed that activists all around DC were recognizing the intersectionality, not just of identities, and I really appreciate Maria's careful pulling out of Black feminist frameworks around intersectionality and identity issues, but also the intersectionality of material issues, right? In their framing of climate justice, something that one finds in the political ecology of the global South literature, for instance, especially questions of land tenure and climate adaptation, let's say in rural India, but we don't see it so much in the intersectionality literature in the global North. For instance, we don't see a conversation on how issues of climate and labor might intersect, or issues of climate and housing might intersect. So this is what I call the intersectionality of issues, right, of materialities. At a People's Climate March in 2017, we saw posters like this hanging in one of the wards of James Creek neighborhood, Ward 6. Housing justice is climate justice. As geographer Jennifer Rice and colleagues have argued, unless climate planning explicitly addresses housing equity, it can risk reinforcing gentrification. And as Isabel's collaborative work has shown, including some of the work we've done together, real estate projects that tout sustainability and green aesthetics inevitably drive up housing prices, making it harder for low-income minoritized groups to maintain a foothold in the city. Now, at this same People's Climate March, youth from Soil Generation, a Philadelphia-based collectivity of Black farmers, used street theater to draw connections between police brutality and climate change, summarizing their stance simply as, quote, "We're not just here for climate justice," end quote. Robert Bullard, the veteran environmental justice scholar and activist, has also called for environmentalism to be, quote, "broadened to incorporate organizations and groups that may not necessarily have environment in their name," end quote. If there's two takeaways that I'd like you to have from my talk, it's this. It's literally these two poles. So we're not just here for climate justice, and broadening the sphere of activism, action to groups that do not just have environment in their name, and more broadly, theoretically, beyond the pale and the strictures of liberal environmentalism that tend to bound the environment and climate within specific categories, right? And so this is really sort of drawing from activist narratives. This is really at the center of my theorizing, and why I wanted to share this work with you. So, these are my research questions. Number one, what are the historical and intersectional causes of climate-related precarity in Washington, D.C.? And number two, what grassroots idioms and forms of action are responding to intersectional climate precarities, even if not explicitly framed as climate interventions? Now, while vulnerability and precarity are terms often used interchangeably, and I use them interchangeably too, I prefer the term precarity because it removes the spotlight from the sense of an innate susceptibility to harm, such as concepts like poverty, and shifts it to the structural and political economic ways in which that susceptibility is reproduced. The term precarité, can be traced back to Bourdieu's class and labor-specific notion of precarity, from whence Marxist theorists started to theorize the term precariat. Bourdieu argued that globalization and fragmentation of the labor market had created a new generalized and permanent condition of insecurity for workers, which he called precarity. However, scholars such as Judith Butler and Jasbir Puar have reframed precarity in more than class terms by understanding precarity as the ways that socioeconomic and political institutions distribute the conditions of life unequally. Quote, life without the promise of stability, in Anand Singh's word, the anthropologist. And so it is for its political and theoretical connotations that I tend to prefer the word precarity over vulnerability, though I do use both and I do understand its valence coming from people in the field. I just want to put that out there for something for us to think about. because it's a conversation happening in anthropology and cognitive fields right now. So our research was concentrated in the Ward 7 area. So again, remembering that map I showed you earlier, it's one of the deep red colors in the wards on that map. It's across the Anacostia River. So we selected this area because, as I just showed you, this was considered one of the most climate vulnerable wards in the city, where 94% of residents are Black, and where Black households have considerably less net worth than white households. This is also where environmental health issues such as asthma and pediatric asthma emergency room visits are the highest in the district. So we used an array of methods to answer these two questions that I just laid out, including archival research into DC's environmental and land use history conducted at the National Archives and the papers of the Senate Committee on the District of Columbia. We also implemented a 193 household survey to try to uncover intersectional precarities. And we conducted participant observation in the neighborhoods of Kenilworth, Eastland Gardens, Paradise at Parkside, and Mayfair Mansion, which is very unfortunately named mansions because it is really not mansions. These are all historically low-income housing developments. We also conducted a walking history tour with Justin Leaney, who is the Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner. It's a locally elected representative. And he told us a lot about the history there. I'm actually speaking on a panel with him in 2 weeks on climate justice. And then we interviewed neighborhood leaders like Ms. Tina Beeks, who you see pictured here with a historic photograph of Parkside at Kenilworth. So I just want to pause for a second and reflect on my research ethics. And thank you, Alice, for bringing that up in your work as well. And the positionality of what it means to do research in predominantly Black spaces in a historically Black city. Being neither Black nor white, I am neither insider nor outsider, but sometimes can be viewed as both at the same time. I did some of this research while I was 6 to 8.5 months pregnant. This was the first and last time actually that I've actually done research in that condition. And it was sometimes just being present in that mode that made it possible to strike up conversations, especially with older women. It was never, nor can it be my goal to be an insider in these spaces, but it was imperative to form a multiracial team of researchers that were reflective of their own positionalities, a Black graduate student, a Latina undergraduate student, several white students and a white professor, and myself, someone who identifies as Indian American. Neighborhood leaders are cautious about outside researchers like us, and rightly so. It was not easy for us to win the trust of Ward 7 elected representatives, residents, and organizers. We respected the wishes to keep them apprised of our work. We offered archival photographs, Senate hearings, and other data that we had gathered. And as director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at AU in 2020, I began to offer pro bono technical and GIS, Geographical Information System support to neighborhood representatives and activists so they could present these at their meetings. And this has been a really rewarding experience for all concerned. I've also tried to write publicly and feature their work and share this with them so they can share with their networks. Now, all of this is to say that this is not a decolonial approach. It is a work in progress, and I welcome critique and feedback at any time. Okay, so in the rest of my talk, I'm going to focus on these two questions that I mentioned, starting with the first one and then moving to the second one. So our project started by digging into the long ecological and political history of the city, and is inspired by the late geographer Clyde Woods' approach to studying the effects of Hurricane Katrina on New Orleans. For Clyde Woods, the roots of climate disaster in New Orleans in the Gulf Coast were set in motion centuries before Hurricane Katrina struck, right? Deep in the settler colonial plantation economies of the US South and in the subsequent organized abandonment, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it, orchestrated by the so-called Bourbon Bloc, a term he uses to name the entanglements between white power, plantation power, oil wealth, and neoliberal austerity. The Anacostia watershed of DC wrested from the Nacotchtank tribe of the mighty Piscataway Nation, on whose land DC sits, is a similar tale to Woods' analysis to settler ecological wreckage from the 1600s onwards, draining much of the eastern DC and Maryland waters, especially from the Chesapeake Bay. The Anacostia watershed provided the stolen soil, water, land, and later concentrated the enslaved labor for vast tobacco and wheat plantations for roughly 200 years. In the lead up to the Civil War, abolitionist groups such as the Anti-Slavery Society of America, in which DC's own Frederick Douglass played a prominent role, would often seize upon DC's paradoxes that represented the country itself, hollow declarations of liberty against the lived horrors of Black enslavement. So after the abolition of slavery, there were some key ecological shifts that happened in the area, and I'm just going to go through 3 developments. The first is the intensive federal and militarized dredging of the Anacostia River, right? The Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency tasked with floodproofing and malaria eradication and draining swamps, dredged the Anacostia River, right, starting from the early 1900s. And they sort of pulled up mud from the river to widen the channel for ships to go through. And they dumped this on the Anacostia Flats, which eventually became the soil upon which several Black families were displaced in the mid-20th century. So the second development is this process that James Baldwin referred to as Negro removal, quite literally the displacement of slum alleys of Blacks fleeing racial terror and Jim Crow from the deep South, right? And so they were all these laboring groups were occupying major areas of the city, but in Negro removal, they were displaced to those areas east of the Anacostia River that had been produced by the Army Corps of Engineers, intense ecological maneuverings to the landscape. And then the third trend that's really key to know is that those areas east of the river, and they're often referred to as east of the river, as kind of out of sight, out of mind, became repositories for the entire area's waste, right? So there was an open burning landfill there called the Kenilworth Dump from the 1940s to the 1960s, where all this trash was kind of trucked to from the district. And that actually became very close to all those Black neighborhoods and developments that I pointed to earlier. Finally, the dump was closed in 1968 because a young boy was playing and then fell into the flames and died. But the whole area remained a dumping spot, a legal dumping spot for over 4 decades. My student is actually studying the efforts to remediate the soil, and this is all east of the Anacostia River in our study site. When we visited in 2017, we saw barbed wire and caution cones fencing off the site, located not far from an elementary school. And the dioxin, the kind of toxics are still in the soil in the area. And this was kind of part of our understanding of how climate precarity is produced through the long durée of environmental racisms in the plural. So for geographer and Laura Pulido, environmental racism is constituent of racial capitalism and operates through certain places and people being designated as sinks for pollution and toxicity so that other places can be valued, namely parts of the wealthier and whiter parts of DC near the Potomac River. Okay, so I want to move now to a few insights from our field work in Ward 7. We implemented a survey of 193 households in Ward 7 to determine some of these intersectional precarities and everyday challenges. And this was a key kind of quote that came out that really defined a lot of the things we were finding and again, she uses the term vulnerability, which is also telling of its valence on the ground. But she said, when I think of vulnerability, it's day-to-day surviving, the struggle for transportation, to get around, food to eat, jobs, shelter, and the life struggles. People are just trying to manage and deal with the environment around them. There is really no conversation around the intersectionality of issues. And the fact that she said this really kind of, my ears really picked that up. The crisis experience is the day-to-day of existence, just living. Now it goes further than sort of the day-to-day of getting access to food, transportation. Even in normal times, these are challenging day-to-day activities, not to mention during inclement weather, sort of severe heat days or storms, where these neighborhood streets are the last to be cleared. So the snow stays for many more days than in other areas of DC, typical kind of political economy of infrastructure and services in municipal areas. But one of the activists there, Angela Doyne, pictured here, and she's actually a climate advocate for the area. She said something that really kind of troubled me, and I've been still thinking about it a lot, because as we went into this research, we knew this was a very hyper-policed area, right? There's a very uneven geography of policing in American cities. Places without tree covers, places that are hotter, actually have more policing, which is really fascinating. I don't think people have actually looked at the ways in which causality runs here. But Angela said this to me. I don't know if you know this, but they hire more police in wards 7 and 8 over the summer. They intentionally do more policing in the summer because that's when the youth are out. So these issues run real deep. And I think she just kind of left it there. She's not telling me that, oh, climate change is going to cause more policing. That's a bit too simplistic. But the fact is, we have to realize, you know, what's happening when there are certain sort of climatic contexts and undercurrents, you know, and Christina Sharp talks about the weather itself sort of being imbued with racism in many ways, right, in her book. And so I think this is something to think about. Angela further said to me, you know, we were working on campaigning like grassroots on the ground, knocking on doors stuff, and letting people know, hey, this is going on, but what's your immediate need? What's your immediate concern? What's happening with you? And it was, I just got to eat today. Oh, my friend's son was shot yesterday. Things like that happen every day. So these are pressing issues that people aren't connecting to global warming and sea level rise as affecting their daily lives, but it does. And when flood season comes, you're assuming we have to be prepared for that. So there's a way in which like climate change is relegated to the background, very much the background. It's not on people's minds, right? It's, I got to eat, or my son got shot, or something else that's very pressing. But this idea that how are we gonna confront that threat when there are all these other things going on in our life that have nothing to do with climate change? So finally, the question of housing came up over and over again and represents a very key intersection of precarity in addition to questions of food and day-to-day living and questions of hyper-policing. Here you have a kind of protest. Actually, it happened during 2020, Slumlords Out. It's very fascinating, but DC is full of very rapacious landlords who on purpose will not address cockroaches or mold or leaking roofs because they want to drive people out. And then they're very, very greedy in terms of their rental collections, and they're often like flipping houses and apartment complexes so that they can sell them at market rate. So you see that kind of thing happening at the same time that you see gentrification and higher priced homes, new luxury townhomes in the low 300,000s, which is still very expensive for a low-income household in Ward 7. So you see gentrification as a tsunami kind of coming over the river from where, you know. So these kinds of things remind me of Audre Lorde's really famous quote, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And so for me, abolitionist climate justice is a pragmatic framework to think about and to respond to these intersectional precarities. And I think that the abolitionist part both is appropriate as an idiom because DC has an abolitionist history, but also very much speaks to the way these precarities are actually intersecting on the ground in people's lives. And so I just want to end on a kind of hopeful note in talking about some of the folks I met in the area who are really doing the work of what it means to care for seniors who are stuck and stranded during storms, what it means to care for young kids. We interviewed Ms. Tina Beeks, pictured here, showing us historical photos of one of the housing complexes, Paradise, when it was first built in the 1960s. She works tirelessly to channel food banks and church donations to the community to help stave off hunger, especially for children and seniors. And because of her longtime embeddedness in the area, people refer to her as Mama, which shows the kind of relationality that she had. She liaises with DC Office of Aging, also social services and health services to ensure that these areas are not neglected, particularly during emergencies. And one person describing this talks about there being a lot of social connections that exist. In our paper, we talk about how these are under the radar. They're not necessarily legible within the rubrics of liberal environmentalism, right? But they exist, and they're the kind of glue and cohesion that actually makes people's lives possible. They offer each other all sorts of support. How do we strengthen those bonds? That's what we need to focus on. Instead, there's a city's response, which is almost always to bring in outside people and groups in to help. Finally, I wrote about, I profiled in the abolitionist magazine, The North Star, the work of Bruce Parnell, who is also a Ward 7 organizer. And here he's holding up a picture of his ancestors, Mary Shad, who was a Canadian abolitionist who helped people escape slavery into the North. And he comes from 5 generations of abolitionists. And he talks about his ancestors being station masters in the Underground Railroad. So he had these carefully preserved portraits, and I really enjoyed kind of leafing through all his old photographs, including of Douglas himself. Parnell's activism insists on healing, de-escalation, and transformative justice as key abolitionist tenets for moving forward. He said, quote, "I don't think anybody is healed from these things, but it's a process. We're moving towards liberation and freedom." Sorry. So coming from 5 generations of abolitionists, his theory of change focuses on the ethics of care, on trauma healing and de-escalation. His target groups are teens and senior citizens, 2 spectrums of vulnerable residents who also happen to be amongst the most climate precarious residents, especially during extreme weather. He cultivates transformative justice spaces for victims and perpetrators of violent harm, thus reducing the need for police intervention. So this is called de-escalation in American abolitionist politics. How do you solve problems that could escalate into violence before they escalate into violence, right? So because police are always hovering around and trying to control youth, it's sort of bringing the youth in to transform relationships so that they don't depend on the police. It's really, really fascinating. And so for me, the kind of work that Angela does, Angela told me, Bruce's work is not understood as climate justice, but it matters so much for climate justice. And that also really stuck with me because it reminded me of the Philadelphia soil generation folks I mentioned at the beginning. So in conclusion, as captured by this 2020 Black Lives Matter protester holding up an "I can't breathe" sign, the last words of Eric Garner, an unarmed Black man who was killed in 2014 after being put in a chokehold by New York police. The pandemic of hyper-policing cannot be divorced from health pandemics, from air toxicity, from asthma prevalence, and the uneven effects of climate change. So the act of breathing, a synonym for life itself, was seen as being suppressed in multiple reinforcing and intersectional ways, from racialized policing to racialized housing, to racialized environments, to racialized healthcare. So I probably realize that breathing became a major thing, especially because Black people were not able to get the ventilators that they needed during COVID, and the care they needed, emergency room visits they needed, they were dying in greater proportions. So it became a real concept that brought many different types of intersecting precarities together, this idea of breathing. So I just wanted to end there. So to me, reimagining climate justice intersectionally and through a feminist lens means going beyond the usual suspects of what it means to work towards justice. It means that we're not just here for climate justice. Thank you.
Great. So I think I would invite you three to maybe roll your chairs here so that we can have you all respond to questions. And I welcome you all to ask questions related to the presentations that you just heard, but also questions that you might have regarding how all this relates to your own work. What are the links that you see between these different approaches and case studies or concepts? And we have about half an hour, maybe we can extend a little bit more if you're willing to. And then, yeah, we also have prepared some kind of questions for the panelists, but if we have a rich discussion from the audience, I think we're just gonna keep going with it.
Yeah, and YouTube people can post questions.
And the YouTube people can post questions. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing this so that they can see everybody. Great. So maybe I'll take 2 questions at a time, and then we can press in together.
Here's my earlier question too.
Isabel, and then you, yeah.
And it's a quick question, Maria. the question of positionality also depending on where we are. I think it's interesting to reflect on the quote from the, I think, bisexual South American woman who described herself as white in a society in Spain where, in general, migrants from Latin America are not described as white. So I was curious if you had reflected on that. And then you take the context of the US, when I think that anyone from South America is automatically, at least, within these very core statistics, a Latinx minority. So anyway, yeah, I was just wondering about this kind of identity question.
I also have a question for you. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. My question relates to the fact that you ask participants to separate their identities to understand how they feel in each space. And I'm wondering, to which degree do you think this is possible, and as an exercise to think of yourself with your different axes of identity, or if you have some, for instance, that this exercise, it's not possible, and in the outcome you see that identities inevitably are attached to each other.
Okay, thank you for your questions. In relation to positionality, I think it's really interesting what you were saying. I have been thinking about this a lot, mainly because all our framework is from North America, is from the US, also on intersectionality and racism, and then it's really difficult to apply it to our context. So how race, ethnicity, I mean, it's really different how it works here. It has to do with colonization, it has to do with Islamophobia, it has to do with all these historical processes that are very complex, but we have other ways of understanding these processes of racialization. Also, they have been very different in recent years because of migration, for example. And I think it's really important to contextualize our research where we are doing our research. And it's really difficult when all this knowledge production occurs in North America and in English, and then we take it as the relevant literature to read. So if we write an article in Catalan, it doesn't have impact, it doesn't even count on your CV, but if you write it in English, it counts. And so I'm really worried about what are these, so where theories come from. It's difficult here that we read from Latin American scholars, even though they write in Spanish, which would be easier maybe for us. But I've seen many scholars working here on intersectionality that mainly quote North American scholars. So I think it's an issue on how we conceive race. And then in my empirical work, I've seen that the concepts that people normally use in intersectionality scholars use do not fit in our context. So how we define white or black maybe is not useful here. I've always considered myself as white, but then when I travel to the North Europe, they say that I'm not white, which is something that it doesn't have to do with my experience here and my privileges here as being white. So I think it's an interesting question, and I think that this my conclusion is that we have always to contextualize such concepts and understand where they happen. So it's an open question, it's an open issue, but I think that the issue is contextualizing and understanding how these concepts work. And in relation to the separability of identities, it's possible. When people try to do it, they are capable of separating the causes of their discomforts. And it's difficult to understand it in an abstract way, but when you try to do it by yourself, we cannot do it now here, but it's an option. So when you do your relief map, you see that it's possible to do it this way. And this is one of the most central issues of this relief map model, which is this systematic comparison between places and identities. So if I ask you, how do you feel because of being a woman in your workplace, for example, you may say that I'm fine, I'm okay. But if I ask you, and how do you feel because of being white, maybe you feel that there's something different. So maybe you never thought about being white, but you have been thinking about being a woman and you have some experiences you can explain to me. So this systematic comparison, and also to places. So maybe how do you feel as being a woman at work is not the same as when you are with your friends, for example, or when you are at home. So it's precisely this systematic comparison which makes people reflect on things that they normally don't think about. I just found one of the tricky issues in relation to the separation of identities is in relation to sexuality and gender, that also because they are like really interconnected concepts, that sometimes people write things on gender that I would consider that they are related to their sexual orientation, for example, but I think it's because they are related to each other in a very specific ways, and sometimes it's obviously difficult to separate. Thank you.
Do the rest of you have anything to comment on that? Because sometimes, there's ideas that relate to your research that might come up as you hear each other. If not, we can move to another question.
Well, I really love the framing of comfort and discomfort. It's extremely powerful. I have a quick story just to tell on that. I think those terms, as you said, are starting points of conversation. So I remember being at a faculty meeting, and it was the question of hiring a senior African-American professor. And all the faculty of color were in favor of hiring him, and all the white faculty, or many white faculty, were not in favor of hiring. So
Was it a man or a woman?
the person we were thinking of hiring was a man. So a white faculty, senior faculty member said, I'm starting to be really uncomfortable with this conversation. So I put up my hand and said, we need to sit with the discomfort. And everyone felt silent. I said, that's good. I'm really glad you're feeling uncomfortable, because we need to sit with this discomfort right now, right? I mean, we for the first time, the School of International Service is considering a tenure case of an African-American woman, and it's historic, but it's crazy. We're 2022, right? And so this whole thing of like, you need to always make me comfortable because I'm the normative center is just really problematic. And I wonder if discomfort can actually be a starting point for conversation.
So I was gonna say the same thing in the question that I had when you were talking, Maria, around the kind of productive potential of discomfort, as opposed to thinking about people being comfortable in different spaces all the time and working towards that. And exactly what we've been saying, like, have you worked at all with the productive potential of feeling very uncomfortable for some people to move into a different, to move forward in terms of identity and the spaces in which they work?
Yeah. Can we...
Yes.
Yeah, so I just like erased the slide on this issue on this type of the types of comfort and discomfort that I've been thinking about, because it's not the same. For example, the sense of discomfort that Sarah uses, it's a systematic discomfort, what I call it, systemic or systematic discomfort that are due to your positions in social structures, and also that are repeated in a daily basis, so that you feel discomfort because of being Black in many places of your everyday life. But then there are also what I call the circumstantial discomforts, that are those discomforts that you may feel. For example, in an interview, a heterosexual young man said that he felt discomfort in an LGTB pub, and it's okay. You may feel. I mean, I can in a LGTB pub. So, I mean, you can feel discomfort there because you are maybe the only heterosexual that is there, but it's not systemic or systematic. But it's also a discomfort, yes, exactly. And we have to treat it differently. But we can say that it is a discomfort, and maybe, for example, in a feminist collective, you can feel discomfort because of being heterosexual, and maybe this is an issue to think about. Right. But it's different. And then there are also the ethical discomforts, that's how I call it, that it's when are discomforts that are not related to your personal positions, but are related to your political or ethical positions. Like, for example, I found it with people that work with vulnerable groups, and they feel discomfort because of the situation of racism or homophobia, even though they are not lesbian, gay, or racialized people. But it's a really interesting discomfort, I think, because it doesn't have to do with this identity politics, but with political perspectives and political positions. And I think they are really interesting discomforts for creating bonds. And at the same time, there are different types of comforts in the same way. So it's not the same when I'm feeling comfortable because I'm in a place where, as a woman, for example, I've created a situation in my feminist collective, for example, where I feel comfortable. So, I mean, there are also different types of comfort in this sense, which is not always the same in relation to how comfort or discomfort are related to social positions and social structures. So, the specific discomfort you were saying would be one of these circumstantial discomforts, which is a discomfort. And it's interesting to think why it is a discomfort, but it's not related to a structural position of.
If there's no, yes, Anna, and then I put myself on the line. Let's take two at a time and then you two, okay? Yeah. Anna.
Okay, I have a question for Malini, but if the others would like to say anything, that would be appreciated as well. There's actually a question that someone asked me, and I'm outsourcing because it's been bugging me for months. So I wrote this article called Intersectional Climate Justice. And what someone asked me was, if it is justice, isn't it intersectional by definition, by default? So I'm kind of like in the same vein, if it is justice, isn't it abolitionist, anti-colonial, feminist by definition? And if not, why? Do we need to, keep on saying those terms so that they become the new norm and become redundant? Or yeah.
Okay, hold that. Mine is more, as I was listening to you three, I was thinking, okay, when we heard about relief maps, could we like take this concept and try to apply it to our work on climate adaptation or mitigation and talk about climate relief maps, but in an emotional way, not relief just because, if you have shadow, you have relief from the sun, but also if that infrastructure or that network or that condition you're in makes you feel safer towards climate risks, but also relief in the physical sense of relief. So could we take this concept of relief maps and the methodology, applying it to climate, to the experience of climate risk in the everyday? And if so, could your research, Maria, also reveal something about because you spoke of the people who say I'm good, like this flatline people, but we haven't discussed much. What about the people who are vulnerable groups or have vulnerability aspects in their intersectional identities? What is it that makes them feel more or less comfortable? So what is it that makes a Black person more comfortable in a situation that we would maybe expect them to be less comfortable? What are these structures that might relate to what Malini talked about issues and aspects of care that help people confront multiple, different stressors, some of which climatic, others have to do with, historical racism and so on. So I'm trying to see whether there is a connecting line to understanding what relief or resistance to or resilience to climate risk could look like and how we could study it, but by looking at care, at emotions, at how people feel in certain situations. So it's a question for the three of you, or maybe, if it's too broad, we can also take it up tomorrow, but I just wanted to lay it out there.
I'll just make one comment on that, is that sort of the void in terms of the connection between the emotional, which I so appreciated in your work, and any kind of climate theorizing around climate risk and adaptation. And I was thinking the same thing when you were talking about whether there's potential to integrate that kind of methodology into the work that I spoke about in the first stream around understanding climate risk, lived realities of climate risk, and also experiences of adaptation or resilience interventions at the moment. But the question I keep coming is the ethics question, a methodological question around ethics and around trauma, and about dealing with, with these layers and layers of trauma, and how we do that. The framing that I come with is like, and I'm not saying it's the right framing, but it's the framing it to try and make climate research and action happen in a more intersectional perspective, is to like access large climate funding, and to implement research for a couple of years, and then to think about what that means for policy and practice into the future. And so, yeah, this idea of a scale, you're focusing on the individual and all this emotion and trauma at the individual, but you need to also understand that at scale. And this is also a problem when it comes to climate, climate science and climate information.
So these connections across scale. So a lot of different ideas in there, but the one is the connection between emotion and climate, which is void, and then the ethics aspect, and then the scale aspect of how you work across these scales to understand, and with such depth as well.
So to answer your question directly, I think no, that justice does not imply intersectionality a priori. To me, justice is much like the word freedom, right? It's a sort of a large container, or maybe a different metaphor, you know, a flexible kind of construct that people have molded and is quite historically specific, right? So freedom in the founding of the American Republic was premised on Black enslavement. The white man was free so long as they had property and slaves, right? The ideal of freedom was actually premised on enslavement. And so, but how much has the term freedom changed since then? And it has gone through different iterations. It's also gone through and continues to go through extraordinarily right-wing iterations, right? In terms of the free market and free will and the libertarian notion of freedom from the state. So I think justice is similar in that it's seen many different historical iterations and some that hew very close to the law, for instance, right? Justice can be delivered through the law, and many, you know, even in the legal framework, justice is sort of very squarely centered on Rawlsian concepts of distributive justice and procedural justice. But justice can also be radicalized, right? And it can also be thought of in terms of decolonial ways. And actually, I was having a conversation with Ruthie Gilmore about how does it matter if we talk about decolonial aspects of justice versus abolitionists? And again, these have different intellectual and activist histories, right? There's a sort of decoloniality that has been very much there as among indigenous groups and thinkers, Caribbean, Latin American, of course, also African and further afield, the South Asian post-colonial world. But then abolitionist has a very specific North American geographical location, right? And so I do think that these geographies of theory, like where terms come up, and then the histories of theory matter for how we talk about a concept. And so your article, which I really like and I really appreciate, on intersectional climate justice, you know, is doing theoretical work, and that it's saying that justice is not always, right, intersectional, and certainly climate justice has not been intersectional in many ways. And we're just starting to grapple with what that means, right? And so I think these qualifiers matter because they also talk about where you're theoretically located as a researcher. Because after all, we're all situated. We're not able to encompass the entirety, right? And so it's an important signal to have that. So I think that would be the answer that you could give, or what would give, right? No, not necessarily so. So on your question, I love this idea about how do we incorporate emotional research into climate justice research. And I don't think we have a lot of tools because we're not trained, for instance, as psychologists, but do psychologists even know really how to get at emotion either, right? And so again, it's a very individualizing framework. And so, you know, I was very fascinated by the relief maps and how you get groups to kind of consider their emotional feelings. And I do think that, you know, some of the stuff that I was mentioning from DC about how neighborhoods of the city, so spatiality with very low tree cover, with high heat index, with a lot of policing, with stresses, like they've actually shown that they lead to stress. Like there's ways in which climate change stresses people out, right? And it's not just in terms of heat in your body, but also psychologically. I don't think we know enough about that, right? I mean, we know that walking in a green neighborhood gives us so much calm, right? After a busy day, it's so helpful. But you know that you have to have privilege in order to do that in many cases, in many cities. And so that you know, privilege and comfort and like greening and then spatiality and then the opposite. Like, I think there's just like we can make heat maps all we want, but what are our emotional maps? Like heat is like, maybe we have to have maps that show heat and then like emotional, you know, stress as well. That would be really neat and really interesting.
Great. See how we have 5 minutes more. Maybe we take a couple more questions and allow for answers and then see how we go. Somebody would, yeah, Irenia, and then
maybe you raise your hand first. Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. So I'm maybe bringing like an issue here that like each and every one of you actually like raised, but like maybe a little bit at the margins of your presentations. And so maybe I wanted to hear a bit more on each and every one of your work. How does this kind of like come into light? The issue of disability. I like, maybe I will start from Malini's work. I was wondering if in the kind of like abolitionist climate justice movement that you're looking at and the kind of like activists that you're working with, as to whether like there's also a disability justice kind of like part to it, and if this is being raised by the local activists, or if that is somehow kind of like part of the intersectional politics that are at play in Washington, D.C. when talking about climate change and climate justice from an intersectional perspective. And I also saw that there's the category of disability in the relief maps. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit more about that, and what kind of like came out of it. How do people kind of like engage with that specific kind of like experience, or lived experience. And you also like at some point kind of like pointed to the aspect of disability as like one of many categories of vulnerability, or somehow kind of like looking at disability as a pivotal experience of climate vulnerability. So maybe I just wanted to trigger a little bit of conversation on this matter.
Yes, thank you. It's more a question for Edith. I was wondering, how do you work on, how do you apply a gender and intersectional perspective within the South African and beyond, like the African context? And just because, well, I'm working in Kenya on gender issue as well, and sometimes I feel a bit discomfortable because like those gender and intersectional perspectives, as we say, come from more like a Western North American historical context, and sometimes I'm working with communities who haven't really reflected on what is gender or intersectionality, and I just feel I'm bringing all these concepts from Europe, and it doesn't make sense for them, although it's not to say that there is no feminism or there is no gender inequalities in Africa, it's just that maybe it's not framed the good way. So as a South African researcher, maybe you have like more light on it.
Yeah, so it's a key question, and it obviously differs from one place to the next. And the work that I spoke about now is not actually focused in South Africa. It's looking at some Zambia and Namibia and Malawi. And even so, for example, through in terms of LGBT rights, all of those places have different legislation around LGBT communities. But then that's one aspect of different dimensions of identity and living conditions. And so it's something that we're still grappling with, but I think a key component is very much sort of a grounded perspective, a bottom-up perspective, and not imposing. So we've chosen these two particular identities to explore. Initially, we were thinking about not imposing any kind of sort of identities or living conditions, and to try and through very safe processes see what emerged as important living conditions and identities and the intersection between those to explore further. But I think a key point there is to work with groups who are already working on the ground, and to hold this idea of intersectionality. I'm not an expert in intersectionality, but to hold it lightly, and to understand those living conditions and identities that emerge, and then to explore those further. So I think the key point is to very much not, bring in the strong framework from this perspective, European perspective, and to work a lot with people who are already working, have been doing similar work for a long time.
Right. And you all want to take turns for the disability related question?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. In many ways, I think disability justice marks some of the limit of where environmental justice still has to go, right? You see very little conversation in environmental justice more generally on intersections. And when I was talking about intersectionality of issues, questions that come up around housing and planning, but those are so integral to disability. I can certainly say from the Washington, D.C. context that the very fact that Bruce Parnell, as an abolitionist, focuses on seniors means that there's a certain way in which there are disabled populations being captured kind of implicitly, but it's not an explicit focus. And so I think that's really missing. Shifting to another geography that I'm intimately connected with, which is India. There, and what I wanted, maybe we can talk a little bit about it tomorrow, but this whole idea of we're not just here for climate justice really resonates in India as well, because the issues there are very much around labor and accessibility, and land rights issues. And one of my friends, Jayana Kotari, is actually a lawyer trying to fight for disability rights, but especially disability rights for informal populations that really have no access to healthcare, and especially during an extreme flood event, it's impossible for them to get out or do anything. So there's that precarity is so compounding for disabled populations. And so through her work and through also knowing that this is sort of a frontier, that there's really not a lot published, but just hearing what people are doing is really that's my window into that. But I really appreciate the question.
Yeah, again, a key question that I don't have a lot of experience in. But that I was wondering, when you talk about disability, are you talking about physical disability, or are you talking about disability in a broader sense?
In a very broad sense, also connecting it with kind of like the concept of body mind, so not disassociating like the body from the mind, but also chronic illnesses. So in a very broad perspective.
So I think it is extremely under-researched in a lot of the contexts in which I'm working, particularly the relation to trauma and what that does in terms of the body-mind connection. But some of the stuff that I was reading recently and what I really liked, what really stuck with me is this idea of sort of disability as being the way that society responds to people's whatever it is that's stopping them from being able to access or to be able to express themselves in the way that they want to. And so I think bringing that into the work that we do is really key, because there's still, in a lot of places, there's still sort of very traditional idea of disability. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that sense. And still the idea of which is important to people who are in wheelchairs can't access toilets in particular locations, which is extremely important. But beyond that, there's really so much work to do. And so, yeah, I can't speak much more about it in depth, but it's really important.
And yeah, disability has not been my specific focus of research, but I know some scholars in Colombia, for example, that have been using disability and age specifically for children with disabilities and their experiences in the urban environment in some cities in Colombia, for example. So this tool can also be used in this sense, even if there are some limitations of the use, because you have to see it, you have to write. So there are some issues also related to how to who can use this tool and who cannot. And this is something I've been thinking about, and we've tried, for example, when I was working in Brazil with people who couldn't even read or write, we used images instead of words, for example, so that there are also different ways of working on these issues. And I also wanted to say something about your questions of the round before. In relation to if the relief maps can be applied to the climate risk, I think that I'm here to see if collectively we can answer to this question too, because I don't know. I have some ideas, but I really don't know, and I would really like to hear your thoughts about it. And it's been really inspiring to me to hear also all these different perspectives. And also what you were saying before in relation to what makes a Black person be more comfortable in a specific place. Well, what I've seen with all the data I have on different relief maps is that that there are many different issues. So that there's a great variability on what makes you feel more comfortable or what makes you feel more discomfort in some specific places. Sometimes it has to do with the characteristics of the space specifically, sometimes on the social relations and power relations that are in this specific place. But it obviously also has to do with intersectional relations. So sometimes your other positions work as mitigation elements and sometimes as accentuation elements. So maybe if you are Black, but you are young and you're a man, maybe being young and a man could be thought as privileged positions, but when you relate this to racialization, sometimes it's the contrary. So Black young man in public space in Barcelona, for example, feel more discomfort, also because of being men, which from an intersectional perspective is really interesting, because the categories that you think that may work always as a privilege. Sometimes they don't work as a privilege. So it also has to do with this interrelation between different positions and obviously in relation to space. And the last thing is in relation to scale. It's something that I've been thinking a lot, because with the relief maps, I normally use these kind of places of the everyday life, like home, public space. Sometimes the scale really varies. So if there's a person that has migrated from South America, they also write like Argentina in the relief map, even if it's like a very broad concept, but it's important for the lived experience of how they felt in Argentina, how they feel here. And for example, I'm working with one of my PhD students is working on home and the different rooms of home for LGTB youth that live with their parents. So we are looking at how people feel, people have different experiences in their own room, in the living room, in the corridor, or in the kitchen, or in the bathroom, in relation to the different positioning. And it's really interesting to see how the house, it's not a homogeneous concept. So in private spaces, there are many political and social relations that also have on them, violences, but also resistances, and that they are different maybe in the different rooms of a home, which is also going into a different scale. And I find it really important to take these private spaces also as political spaces.
Great. So I think we should close now. For those of you, so first of all, thank you so much for the panel today.